All right. Welcome to this special session that we have on making decarbonization fair, which will specifically look at perspectives from both ends of the spectrum. We have with us Lawrence Jones, Vice President International from the Edison Electric Institute, which represents utility associations across the US and increasingly globally. And coming in from Bangalore, India today, we have Harish Hande, who has been a pioneer in bringing community energy, specifically in the beginning to low-income and remote communities in India, but now looking more at how do we bring democratized systems into the broader energy system. And we're going to focus this session on electrification and decarbonizing. And I'm going to just quickly give you a few facts and figures about the EU situation. Then I'm going to let both Lawrence and Harish have a little chat about their perspectives on decarbonizing in a fair way. Because this session is only half an hour long, we do encourage you to put questions into the chat area, and we will take questions probably in the last 10 minutes, but I do want to make sure that we give both Lawrence and Harish enough chance to have some meaningful input into this discussion. So quickly, I'm going to tell you some facts and figures. Obviously, electrification is central to decarbonizing Western economies, averting emissions in developing countries, and also lifting people out of energy poverty in relation to Sustainable Development Goal number 7. In the EU context, in the EU Green Deal, that threatens to push up demand for electricity by 150%. And this explosive growth needs to be matched by massive buildup of renewable supply and also massive buildup of transmission and distribution systems. Some reports have estimated that against a current 25 gigawatts of renewable capacity in the EU, by 2050, we will need to have 400 to 450 gigawatts of renewable capacity to have a clean electricity system. And that could cost anywhere from 170 to 200 billion euros. So it's a massive scale up, it's a massive investment, and there's lots and lots of challenges related to how to make that fair. So I'm going to let you both have your few minutes now to give your perspectives on how to make decarbonization fair. And Harish, I'm going to hand the floor to you first, as you've been really working in this in quite a while.
Thanks, Marling, and thanks for actually inviting me. And hi, good morning, Lawrence, all the way from the US. What happens typically, Marlon, is that everybody talks about from a supply side and saying that, okay, how do we, and there's no questioning. Yes, there was a, and we are talking of the legacy of the grid. Grid existed. Grid was okay for a certain period of time. Everything is getting decentralized in many ways. So it's high time we actually talked about the input of energy into any product, whether you talk about a sewing machine, a blacksmith blower, or a silk weaving machine, has to be kind of part of the product, institutionalized rather than think separately. I'm buying the sewing machine and then I'll buy the electrons for a 20-year period of time. Why not I bundle those electrons together and actually provide a sewing machine that comes with a power package? And today I have one sewing machine, tomorrow I have 2 more. Yeah, after a year when my grandkid actually develops, I'll have one. Why can't we look at an alternative mechanism of delivery of energy that is sustainable? So rather than always talking from a demand perspective. So if you look at the population in India, and what we are trying to club or say that sustainable energy is a very important component for poverty reduction, and it is used as a catalyst for development, where the added benefit is the solutions to climate. Make development the centerpiece, the demand the centerpiece. What does the end user want? And suddenly we start realizing that, why are we talking about renewing the grid? Why not we looking at renewing people's homes? Why not we look at renewing people's livelihoods, renewing the services that the people get in terms of health and education? Automatically, we talk about development, and automatically we talk about decarbonization, rather than thinking it as a separate entity. And that's what I would say. If you look at the South, if you look at Africa, and if you look at India, the subcontinent of India, Indonesia, and this way in Latin America, we would look at the bottom 40 to 50% of the poorer population in the world will showcase how the world can be sustainable. And that will lead to technology innovations that the upper class will start using it in many ways. So in everything else we talk about trickle down, here it's going to be trickle up. Thank you.
Thank you, Harish. Lawrence, over to
Thank you.
you.
Thank you, Marilyn. And Harish, nice to see you. Thanks for having me, Marilyn. I think, I agree with everything that Harish has said. I will just augment it with the following observation that obviously there is no one size fits all to decarbonization and electrification. I think if Harish was talking about India, Africa, I would brought in the conversation to say the OECD countries and others where there is also the issue of making sure the energy transition is just and fair for everyone. And I think one thing to think about in that context, 3 points I will make. The first thing here is the importance of infrastructure. I think, yes, we need to have decentralized solutions for many parts of the world, especially in rural communities, but also in the semi-urban communities. But I think increasingly in the urban communities, if you look at the vexing population centers around the world, there is going to be a need for having, the grid infrastructure built. How you build it is a different issue, but you will need a hybrid system of both centralized and decentralized systems. And that tackles the issue of affordability, because at some point, as we talk about decarbonization, we need to keep in mind the importance of resilience. And I always say that resilience, as we've seen in many parts of the world over the last month, we had an issue, an event in the US, we had an event in Europe. We have to keep resilience as the sort of underlying theme as we talk about how do you build a just transition. And it's not just the physical resilience of the grid, it's also the resilience of the consumers. Because like Harish said, even if you were to be disconnected from the grid, you have issues as it relates to cybersecurity, even though you might have a decentralized technology that is connected to the internet. And so I think we need to take a holistic view when it comes to just making the energy transition just. I think decarbonization, the other point I will make is the need for diversification. Oftentimes we try to look at, like Harish said, the decarbonization from maybe the supply side. I think we need to look at the supply side, the demand side, and the infrastructure piece. Put it all together to be able to say, okay, how do you then look at the cost benefits of decarbonizing? How do you look at the way how you ensure that decarbonization is actually also going to drive job creation? Because that's one of the areas where you talk about this issue of just transition. And the last point I will make when it comes to resilience is that the regulatory and policy framework have to now factor in resilience as an important component that would allow the utilities, or even I would call it the micro utilities, like some of the ones Harish is working with, to be able to recover the investments that they will make in resilience. And so I think those three issues, making sure you have the infrastructure in place, understanding the need for diversification of both supply, demand, and the grid, and then lastly, focusing on the regulatory and policy models. I think those three coming together, in addition to what Harish said, is one way we can start thinking about making sure that the transition is fair.
Thank you both. Great points. And Harish, I wonder if you'd like to respond to that in the experience that you've had within India, and now I know you're also doing some work in Africa, in, first of all, building up these systems in remote areas, and now working more and more to bring solar into other systems.
Yeah, so see, for us is the way we look at it is, again, it's about how do we use poverty as a centerpiece and eradication, and how can other pieces of the puzzle, why are people poor? People are poor for multiple reasons: lack of access of appropriate health, lack of education, and lack of opportunities for livelihoods. In many a case, sustainable energies actually play a very, very powerful, in many of the remote areas, for example, the equipments are so it's when we design a solar for a swing machine, a lot of people say solar is expensive. Nobody says the swing machine is inefficient. It's the inefficiency of the livelihood products. So moment you start creating efficient livelihood products like swing machines, silk weaving machines, the blacksmith blower, the bread making machine, Suddenly you democratize livelihoods right at the doorstep. With a couple of solar panels, you suddenly have a livelihood generation startup. Secondly, the expensiveness of the medical equipments like the autoclaves, the baby warmers, all that is required in a maternal labor room. Lot of places, it's not only the human resources. Many a time the too much sophistication of medical equipments forces medical equipments to be actually in a centralized place like hospitals. If somebody looked at high energy efficient medical equipments with what is actually low resource, you suddenly democratize the delivery of health. Digital education, high efficient television nets, the nets connected to the internet, democratized in COVID. For example, in the COVID times, we ourselves did 200 hospitals, remote hospitals, swab collection centers, remote schools where teachers were not going because of COVID. Suddenly solar powered internet teaching at rural schools on TV completely democratized education. So the beauty of sustainable energy is it doesn't matter how remote you are, not remote you are, you could actually power those. And those three, livelihoods, education, health, the three powerful tools to get people out of poverty could be done using, and that's what we've been trying to put, Marlin. And the last one I would actually push for is is democratizing of social sustainability, where the people have equal opportunity to become a next Einstein or a next what you call it as a Madame Curie. Is lack of access is preventing 600 million people in India and Africa to have the same opportunities that you and me have. And that is where I'm saying, let's, can we democratize together rather than thinking electricity separate, education separate, livelihood separate. Let's push it together to make that happen.
If I may just build on what Harish said, Maryland, and I think it's a very important point. I like the four aspects of it. The only thing I will add to it is finance, right? Because I think part of the challenge for many parts of the developing world is that people want these resources, but the business model for them getting it is not important. I mean, it's not there. And so one of the things I've been thinking about, and I had some conversations with someone recently, is microfinancing of these kinds of systems, right? Because you cannot apply the financial regulatory model for centralized systems similarly to what you do for decentralized systems. So you need a hybrid sort of a link between the two. And the last point I will make is, yes, we have to remember also that all of these decentralized solutions must be manufactured, right? And so manufacturing, again, then requires some degree of centralized. So that's why hybrid thinking is very, very important, and not the either or proposition you sometimes see when you put people together for these kinds of conversations.
Great, thank you. Another reason that I wanted to bring you into this discussion, Harish, is because the EU Green Deal specifically promotes community energy. And I know you've got a lot of experience in terms of how do you set up the ecosystem for community energy, and you ran into a lot of challenges on that. And I wonder if you would just touch on that a little bit for the people listening who are working on community energy in the EU context, where it will be an integration into the grid or at some level.
Well, I'm also glad Lawrence brought in the whole concept of financing, and I think also what we need to learn from the utility players also is asset-based financing, and how, because if poor really have to get out of poverty, it is about asset-based the asset-based financing that needs to come, and that's exactly when countries in Africa as well as communities in India and elsewhere will grow. But the challenges I would say is more on the thinking process of saying that we think in silos. I mean, we think in like you're a mechanical engineer, so you're a solution provider. And the issue is the way our education system is that we put people in boxes. I'm a mechanical engineer, I'm an MBA, I'm a blah, etc. No, when you have to come up with solution in the rural areas, you have to think in terms of finance, assets, technology, business models, social sustainability together. And that's not taught. And that's not taught, unfortunately. And that is where some of the biggest challenges for me is when I have a group is like, you come up with a LinkedIn or a resume that kills the innovation spirit of, especially when you come from an Asian education system, which about its rote best. You tell me how to draw a car with thermodynamics, I will draw it, Lawrence. You show me a car, I will run away. Right? The point is, that's the challenge of how do we make everybody solution oriented, and solar, as I was telling you yesterday, Mali, makes sense for us in three places. And in the developing world where there is no electricity, where there is completely unreliable electricity, and when it's super reliable, electricity is super expensive. Solar makes sense in all three cases. Because of the transmission and distribution losses, the utilities are bleeding. In a country like India, decentralized makes economics. The challenge is that thinking out of the box, and how do you bring in the education system which forces people to be solution providers rather than that's what for me in this sector. When we decarbonize, it's like either you're bucketed as an activist or an environmentalist, or you're bucketed at a different bucket, but not as a solution provider.
Lawrence, do you have a response to that?
I do, and it's actually in support of what he just said, but maybe from a different angle. And that is, maybe we should stop dissecting or demarcating the sectors, right? Because when you say decentralized and you say centralized, it always creates this polarity. And in a sense, we are creating polarity where we want integration. And because the way we talk about these things, right? I've always said that I grew up in sub-Saharan Africa in Liberia. I can tell you, if you give someone ice today as a resource, they would pay anything for ice. But if you ask them to pay for electricity, most likely they won't want to pay because they expect it to be given to them by the government, right? So part of the challenge we have is, like I said, moving from what Harish said, we need to start thinking about the services that need to be provided and enabled by electricity, and let people pay for those services, because someone would pay more for health than they would want to pay for electricity. So if you bundle the pricing structure, where you are now as a utility not delivering electricity, you're delivering a service, and you pay for that service. The problem is the thinking has to change, like Harish said. The regulatory thinking, the business thinking has to change. And unfortunately, when it comes to leapfrogging, and this is one place where I've discussed with folks in the US and around the world, is that people should not look at the regulatory model that got us to where we are today, that needs to adapt, and take those regulatory models and then take those same old ones and take them to Africa or to India. There needs to be a leapfrogging, not just on technology. Technology is not the problem. I think the problem is leapfrogging the regulatory model, the business models. So I'm a utility that delivers services. Well, Mr. or Miss Regulator, how are you going to allow me to recover my investment in the infrastructure to deliver my service? That's where I think the challenge comes. And the last point is community. I love the idea of community energy, but we have to also remember not all communities are wealthy. And so in some cases, you still need to have the utility there providing the service. And so some say, well, the utility shouldn't be involved in community energy. I would disagree, because utility have the experience of raising capital. So you could have a private community energy system that's run and owned by a private entity, but still delivers the service, right? So the tension that exists between these different groups must go away. In fact, when I shared this idea of this conversation today with some of my colleagues, somebody said, well, are you and this Harish guy going to have a battle? Because, he's on the other side of the spectrum, which is how you laid out this conversation. And I said, no, because at the end of the day, we're going to bring the spectrum together. So I said, the goal of this conversation is to close the gap, to move the idea that there's a gap between one side or the other. There is the interplay in the middle. And I think that's what we can work together as an industry.
Lawrence, you brought up a really interesting point that there's been a lot of discussion in Europe about is market liberalization causing more energy poverty? Should we go back to regulation? And I know, Harish, you work in a different way than that. So let's have a little discussion around that. What kind of business model or regulatory model, or who needs to be involved in solving this problem of making decarbonization fair to the users of energy and energy services?
Well, maybe I can start first here. So, because I've really spent some time thinking about this. So as I work with electric utilities around the world, one part of my work is to also work with regulators and investors. And there is no one size fits all. I can actually identify a country that has liberalized and unbundled their industry and is performing very well. I can equally identify a country that has done it and is working very bad. I can have a country that is fully re-regulated, not liberalized, that's working well, and I can find one that's working wrong. What I think is important is to understand the local context. every country has different politics. Every country has different societal needs. Every country is at a different level of economic sophistication. So I always used to say, when you tell a small country in, say, sub-Saharan Africa to liberalize, and that country only has 100 megawatt of electricity, if they liberalize, what are they liberalizing? Does it even make sense to even bring these concepts? Now, people will say, well, why shouldn't we? The market will deliver. Yeah, the market will deliver where the market has the foundational infrastructure to function. And Harish knows this well. They've tried in India different approaches to liberalization. Some work, some don't work. But if you try to bring a very sophisticated regulatory structure to a developing country that doesn't even have the experience, you're setting yourselves up for failure. And unfortunately, people who point their fingers only look at the failure. So I would say there is no one size fits all. There's a room for everything. Canada have a different set of regulatory models and a different set of ownership structure. It works for them. United States have a different ownership structure when it comes to utilities. It works. So I love to hear your Harish view, because I know the Indian government just issued a new regulatory model for the discos in terms of the ownership, and so I want to hear what he thinks about that new model that they put out there.
Thanks, Lawrence, for asking that question. That question, I would answer while coupling this. Just now, a couple of days I had this. I had another webinar with the Discom of Karnataka where we're working on, right. My push has been saying that the electricity, for example, in Karnataka, electricity needs to actually be coupled with the Ministry of Rural Development and Ministry of Housing, because if by 2035 60% of the buildings in Karnataka have not yet been built. My question is, inefficient buildings, inefficient design of buildings are going to guzzle energy, guzzle cooling loads, which is the biggest fear that India has about air conditioning loads. That's because most of the time we blame it on the air conditioners, but we're not blaming on the design of the buildings. Now, question is, that's where I think the electricity department should look at sitting itself between MORD, and why I'm saying the Ministry of Rural Development is because of the agricultural pumping load. And for agricultural pumping mode to be more efficient, it's not about providing electricity to the pumps, it's providing how much of efficiency of water that is required for the farmers, depending on the cropping patterns, rather than just supplying electricity and people pump water without actually completely flooding the fields. What has happened, Lawrence, in many of it, when we talk about 50 to 60% of our rural loads have been water pumping, people don't realize that because of the free electricity, the water tables have gone down over the years. The question is, who is actually, so we need to couple water efficiency, the cropping patterns, the subsidies in crops, and then electricity needs to play a role. It's not only same way, Marlin, I would say the investments, equal investments in increasing the efficiency of the supply should also be led to investments into products that will increase livelihoods for the poor. Because if by 2035, X number of people, 200 million people are going to come into the livelihood space, they are going to use electric machines like lathe machines, silk weaving machines, motorized machines that will guzzle electricity. That needs to be more efficient. The poor are going to build houses. Those need to be, so why not we look at those being decarbonized today? And that's where a lot of the R&D money and policy should come in. It's a combination of regulatory of electricity combined with the energy efficiency to cropping subsidies. Those three together need to come in play.
I mean, I just want to make one point, and I like the idea of development, decarbonization, electricity. Obviously, I'm biased to say that the future is going to be electric, but I think for that electric future to happen, we also need to look at how we design cities, how we design communities. And this is where I'm very concerned. You said 2035, as population grows and people get out of poverty, how are those systems going to work? How are those people going to function? So you have transportation, you have building codes, you have work creation. I mean, there are a whole set of issues there, but unfortunately, decarbonization many times today in the context of climate change focuses on a single sector,
yes,
right? As opposed to holistic and saying, look, how do we design electricity or energy systems to meet the needs of a growing population who wants all of these different things, and stop just wanting one sector to carry the load? And I think that's where we should be very careful when it comes to FAIR, because maybe the cost of electricity will not be due to the utilities. It may be due to some of the other external things that makes it extremely expensive. So you could still make electricity decarbonization cheaper, but on the other hand, everything else becomes more expensive, right? And so the fairness of decarbonization should go beyond energy. It should make sure that all services are delivered in a cost-effective way, not just electricity.
But for that, Lawrence, the planning has to happen together. I
Yes.
mean, especially India has a chance to look at cities that are growing, saying that how can transportation, Ministry of Rural Development, water have to work together? Not, okay, let me design one, like I'll design 150 public health centers. Can't I bring electricity and design aspects together while I'm designing 150 public health centers, not future as an afterthought? How
Yep.
can I supply energy to it?
Exactly.
We've got 5 minutes left, and so far no questions. So I just want to quickly say to the audience that if you do have a question, get it in quickly. But let's keep going here. Harish, I want to come back to another thing I know about the work you've done. When you go into particularly these smaller communities, one of the first things you do is assess what they really need in terms of electricity or energy. And I think that's something we've lost a sense of in the Western world, is electricity is just so available to us that we don't think about how much we need or how we use it. We just use.
Well, see, I'm going to pick up on what Lawrence said, that it's the future is going to be electric, and that's much more deeper into that statement. Because if you look at simple thing like a pottery maker or a rice mill, somebody who has used a rice mill, and I'm sure Lawrence would relate to it. Many of the rice mills are run on diesel. Moment electricity goes off, you have to have a man with a certain strength to pull the diesel. So it is completely gender insensitivity. The redesign of electric rice mills or a pottery maker, right, solar powered, actually democratizes from a gender perspective. It makes electric motors, electric pottery makers, and all electric rice mills makes it gender inclusive, that women entrepreneurs have another livelihood option to do that. And that's the beauty of actually rethinking the future, what the needs are. And when we talk about needs also, Marlene, we talk about, it's not about needs of the 2 years. Any intervention that we do, is it generational? Let us not just modify a small sewing machine and make it electric. Why not I give them good electric sewing machine right now, so that they don't have to rethink of what type of technology that they need to use in 3 years? Is it generational? And that is where electricity plays a key role in drudgery, generational, and gender sensitivity.
The point he just made, I know you have one more question, maybe two or three, but one point I want to add here when you talk about democratization, let's think about how many of our 80-year-olds understand how to use their cell phones, right? My mother, she's in her 80s, she knows how to use her cell phone. Energy education is extremely important in this context. We need to find a mechanism where we educate people all across countries to understand the value of electricity, the value of efficiency, because the
Right.
risk with abundance, you talk about, Marilyn, everyone who gets 1 kilowatt hour today, they're going to want 10 kilowatt hours tomorrow, right? And so we need to think projection wise. As people come out of poverty, the need for electricity is going to even grow faster, right? Because I go from one refrigerator, air conditioner, microwave, you just name it, right? So thinking long term about how do we educate the public so they know and feel and love electricity like they love their cell phone. That's my goal, right? To love electricity like you love your cell phone.
Malin, if I can just add to what Lawrence said. Lawrence, you brought up a point of abundance, right? That's the power for any type. I mean, that's why sometimes when solar pumps are not environmentally friendly, because solar is free, people misuse water like crazy. It's a combination of water utilization and solar that actually should be. Just because I have 100 solar panels on my roof does not get me to the right to have 10 air conditioners. So my question, we need to think holistically. It's not about one or the other. It's for the sustainability of the world. Yeah.
I'd like to figure out how to convince North Americans to have only one fridge in their houses.
But you see, the problem with that, though, that thinking also affects the business model, because I have built my infrastructure assuming that you would have 5 cars, 5 fridges, whatever the case may be. And if you don't, then why have I built my system? So it's a sort of a catch-22 how you deal with that, and that's why holistic thinking is very important here.
But I think, one of the things we often talk about is in terms of energy efficiency, every unit of energy not used has the greatest value to society. But I think what we don't talk enough about, and perhaps Lawrence, you want to take this in a slightly different direction, but this concept of energy sufficiency. Am I using enough energy to have a good, comfortable, healthy life and not going beyond that? Am I willing to say, given that we need to address climate change, am I personally willing to say I'm going to change some of my energy behaviors? And Lawrence, I think we've talked about this before. Where would you take that?
So this is a very, very personal question for me because I've been spending a lot of time thinking about it. I tie it into the concept of sacrifice, right? I think at the end of the day, sufficiency, which is important, also has to do with what are you prepared to sacrifice? And I give you some stats, right? In Norway, for example, you have maybe I think 25,000 kilowatt hours per person per year. In India, is 900 kilowatt hours per person per year. And so when you then talk about the fairness, the question is if an average Norwegian could reduce their energy consumption by 5,000 kilowatt per hours and allow the Indian to raise theirs, right? You start looking at this concept of sacrifice in a different way. We all want to save the planet. The question is, what are we prepared to sacrifice? And to do it in a way that it doesn't mean your standard of living is changed. It just means your perception of what you need is changing. Last point I will make, COVID-19. What did COVID-19 show us? We are capable of changing our behavior. Well, for the most part, right? We're capable of changing our behavior. The question is, what incentives? In the case of COVID, it was staying alive. That was the incentive, right? And the question we have now is, how do we get people to naturally want to be more efficient in how they use resources, but also prepared to sacrifice for the greater good of the world?
Harish, do you have a response to that?
There's a question for Lawrence, actually.
There is, yes. So Lawrence, we have a question from Carol. Oh no, so superficial impression of regulation in the States is that it has failed at critical points, such as the recent situation in Texas and in the past extensive power cuts in New York and California. Do you have a view that you want to offer on this, Lawrence?
Well, it's a question that requires more than 3 minutes, and I know we don't have much time, but I will just make the following point, right? I think we need to step back when these crises occur and try to understand how do we redesign the regulatory systems. There are progress being made in different places. I would expand the conversation from the United States to the world. And Harish knows this, I want to bring it back to him because part of the challenge with the electricity and energy systems is also very much driven by politics and other external factors. And so you can design a regulatory system as perfectly as you would like. In some countries, when it's time to do load shedding, for example, I know it in my own former country, Liberia, the utility couldn't just do it because there were political implications if they did. So electricity is not a normal commodity. And I think some of the challenges with the regulatory system is how can we depoliticize the regulatory systems around the world to allow them to work without constant regulatory or political interventions. This is one recommendation I will make. Maybe Harish wants to add that.
Yeah, no, you hit, I mean, more than any other country, because electricity and water are always very, very political. And as somebody very in the government always said to me that decentralization goes against that ethos. And so it's something that is very, very political and where it goes through. But on the past thing that Lawrence said about the future, I mean, if you look at the utilities, for example, in a country like ours, where most of it is state owned, it's going to be that way for some time, unless and until we are able to, much better than United States, because of the inefficiencies that are there in our grid, and where if we are able to show the states that going the decarbonized way, that you have enough money to save. See, the state saves more by not supplying electricity, because the amount of money that it's losing, somewhere we need to incentivize the states that go towards decentralization. Part of it, whatever you save, allocate it for health and education. It's more politically savvy for you to look at it that way. So if it's a win-win situation, some of the political class has started to understand that. And I feel in the next 5 years, if you are able to say how much have you saved. I mean, Lawrence, the last thing is that we showed to some of the states that your savings in diesel and you are able to use that money for health and education. Suddenly they realize that, okay, why not I solar power all the PHCs, the public
Yeah.
health centers.
And there should be nothing wrong with private ownership, because I think part of the other challenge is sometimes people
Yes.
don't understand is that the utilities in many countries are the supplier of real revenue to cities and to states,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
So imagine like they have in Cote d'Ivoire, for example, where it's a private operator of the grid. The grid is still owned by the government, but it's operated by a private entity, and that entity is operating on a performance-based framework. You could have the same thing where it's a private community energy system, but there are what do you call it? There are requirements of how they should perform. That way, the investments that is needed to keep the system running is coming through the private sector, but then there are constraints on it being in terms of these are the metrics we expect you to meet. If you meet these metrics, like they have in the UK now, you get certain returns. So there is a way for public-private partnership around electricity and energy system. People need to start demonizing one group or the other.
Harish, any last words from Harish? We've gone a little bit over time, but that's fine. But there is another session starting in 5 minutes. So,
No, my position is my point is that when we are looking at multiple things on a adaptation side, and I mean, let's not in a country like India, where on one hand you have and we keep saying that India is a flat it's a cauldron of world's problems and also cauldron of world solutions, and saying that we have droughts, we have floods, we have slums, we have all places where we can actually look at how energy can lead to upliftment of poverty, could be a showcase to rest of the world. How can we use energy in a much more democratic fashion, in a manner that is sustainable? And that I think, and that is what we're trying to push, is that make development as the agenda in a country like ours and use energy as that catalyst. And I keep hopping that it's, and let's not divide it. Let's not have a Ministry of Power and Ministry of Rural Development separately. It has to be, we need to work in the world of nexus, health energy nexus, health energy water nexus, education energy nexus, and that nexus needs to come in place.
So government should be designed to be more nexus driven, and I like that idea. So like they have in Dubai, you have the Department of Energy and Water in Dubai.
Right.
You have it, I think, in Malaysia. You have a Ministry of Energy, Water, and something else. So I think that's one message for me out of this is to advocate for more nexus thinking within the government. But that's not going to be an easy job, because everybody wants to keep the ministry separate from the other ministry. Every ministry is important in many governments, right? So that's the issue.
I have a question for you then, Lawrence, too. Can you also convince utility companies to be more nexus thinking?
Yes, and we're working on it. And I think you will see that happening more and more in areas of, say, transportation electrification. You will see it happening when it comes to heat electrification. But I think the idea of nexus thinking in utilities is going to come by broadening the notion of what do we mean by utilities, right? So in some countries, you see it happening already, that you're not just talking about electricity, you're talking about these essential services that are enabled by critical infrastructures. So.
All right. We've run out of time, but thank you both for a really, really great conversation. And it's been recorded, so we'll make it available to people, and we'll let you know if any other questions come through that we'd like you to address to those people. Thank you both.
Thanks, Lawrence.
Nice to see you. We'll keep
it going.
soon.